Hi everyone, my name's Bree Neyland. This is our PowerPoint for our virtual learning project, Street Art and Graffiti. It's part of a larger unit called Art as Activism. We have already spent about a week looking at some famous street artists and what street artists are trying to accomplish. Today's lesson starts at slide 9, and I'll walk you through that. But first, let me remind you of what we've been doing so far. You can see right here that we have our link to our unit resources shared document, where students will have assigned groups who will be filling in vocabulary terms and examples of street art that the whole class can then look at. And then, of course, we have a link to our Google Classroom here. Anytime you need to get back to that, just look for that icon. And we'll try and advance to the next slide. Here are our key ideas. These are the key ideas that run through the whole unit. We'll be returning to them. In particular, today we'll be focusing on line, form, and pattern. But we'll also be thinking about evaluating our culture, thinking about context, explaining the artistic vision of our artists, thinking about iconography and symbolic meaning, and how to express an opinion. Here's a summary of the vocabulary words, and again, that link to our Great Finds document or our unit resource page. So students will be addressing some of these vocabulary elements. And then here are the elements of design and the principles of design. And these are a theme throughout our whole class. Today we'll be looking specifically at line, shape, and form and how they impact harmony and rhythm and movement. These habits of mind we've talked a lot about in our class. These are those habits that we want to get you into. And so I encourage you to keep those in mind as you're filling out the reflection at the end. In particular, think about engage and persist when we're working with techniques that we're not terribly comfortable with. How you express yourself and how you stretch and explore so that you can play around with some of these ideas and maybe take some risks and see if something doesn't work, maybe it will yield something else of value or at least generate some ideas. And that's really what our goal is. We're meaning making, we're constructing knowledge. And that's what I want you to think about it as. I don't want you to think about it as the final product. Think instead about the process of creating meaning and how these artists are creating meaning as well. So last week, you looked at 23 amazing pieces of street art around the world, and you spent some time with different perspectives on street art, who different people think are the best and most brilliant, and who doesn't necessarily make the list. And then we spent some time with Banksy, and in particular, we were looking at juxtaposition with Banksy's work. So here we have a soldier with a young girl, two ideas that are juxtaposed against each other that we don't normally associate with each other. And that helps us develop new meaning. The other important aspect of Banksy's work is the fact that he's anonymous, and there's all kinds of controversy over who Banksy actually is. And I think what we came up with in the end was that he was Robin Gunningham from Bristol. Researchers have studied that, and they think with 75% accuracy that he's that person. Why does that matter? What's the point of that? And if you were going to engage in the kinds of communication acts that Banksy does, would you ascribe your name to it? So here are those questions that we've been asking of all of our artists. Why has Banksy, and any of them, chosen to stay anonymous? Should graffiti be legalized? What would happen for Banksy to consider his art a success? To what extent does his work encourage vandalism? Is it vandalism? What is a work of art, right? All of these things I want you to keep in mind, because we're going to create our own tag, which is the first step in engaging with the community and with some of these complex ideas as a form of street art. Now, your tag is who you are, it's your identity. So we're going to include some iconography and some symbolism in there, but it also is an expression of who you believe you want other people to interpret you as. So if you want to be seen as mysterious and exotic, you might use very different colors than if you wanted to be experienced as an artist who was fun and frivolous, right? So we're going to practice using line, form, and color to achieve balance, harmony, and unity. We're going to think about some of the different vocabulary words, tagging, graffiti, street art, throwing, and piecing. We're going to think about iconography. We're going to think about identity, and we're going to analyze some symbolic meanings in here too. Here's a summary of the steps that you'll be doing. Note that step 10 will take you to a quiz. And if you click on this link, here is the quiz. The first question is your name, and you get a point for getting your name right. So please remember to do that. Let me go back to our PowerPoint. There we go. So you'll take that quiz and then you'll submit your reflection at the end. Here's the rubric. We have a focus on line, color, and space in particular. And then under composition, we've got those elements of balance and unity. And then here are the main vocabulary terms for this particular project. And it's these first three that are probably going to be new to you. Tag, throw, and piece. Let me explain what those are when we get the project underway. So you're going to be creating your name, right? And these are some examples from previous students. Here you can see Caden is lined up. We've got a nice line. You can fill in the colors, and we've got gradation in colors there. We have patterning here. We've got patterning in bunny, and then patterning all around the outside. So we have context and iconography around the outside as well. We've got Tyler here, which looks like it's using some 3D effects. We have a much more stylized name here. We've got Sophie up here. I couldn't read that for a second. And then here's a professional artist, anonymous. And his name looks very different. It's much harder to access. It's harder to figure out, but you can see that style is still there. So when you're doing this to turn in at home, I encourage you to take a look at Miss Cloudy's PowerPoint slides, because she has a nice step-by-step process. But also come over here to Web Urbanist's style of graffiti lettering, where you can look at calligraffiti, which I kind of like, and fat cap, which is made with a wide spray nozzle on the paint can, or shadow letters or bubble letters, which I think we're all familiar with, but that'll give you some ideas. Now, for the sake of ease, I have given you some blow-ups of some of the stencils so that you can just copy the letters. And this is the one that I used. It's very similar to calligraphy. And I started with Ravenstone, which is the name of the land that we live on. And you can see the R here, and it's quite stylized, right? But I love the texture in this one too. And then we have snake letters and something more typical of calligraphy again. I like that contrast, and we've got some of the shadowing with 3D bars here. So here's what I did when I created mine. I chose a lettering style. I looked at that calligraphy one, and you can see here's where I traced out the R, and then here's the A, the V, and these are just lines. I love this E. The shape of the E is so cool because it finishes kind of with a heart shape. Like here's another E. And you can see how I've stacked the two E's close together. So they've got two hearts, essentially. I kind of like that. Now this line, that's the tag. That's called tagging. It doesn't have any spaces where you can fill in the color. when you go to make a letter so that it's blocked out and so it has spaces like here to fill in the color, that's called throwing the letters. So I threw the letters here, I fleshed it out so it had something solid that I could color in. And then I outlined them, and then it's much easier to see, and you can start to see those principles of design coming out. Then I started coloring them in, but now I need to give them more depth. I need to give them like perspective and some patterning, and that is called piecing. So when I pieced the letters, I added these 3D bars, and I got some white space in there, and I tried to play around with gradations in color, but it didn't work too well, so I ended up moving to paints to take care of that. I added more color on the outside because these are the colors of the flowers in my garden. Here's the prairie grass. Here's the colors. Ravenstone is the name of our property. Raven is our big icon. It's a symbol of us. It takes into account our love of play, our intelligence, my husband's love of collecting things. And then, of course, we have 9 cats. So here's one of my cats balancing up on the R. Now, because the lettering was hard to see, I decided to go back over it with paint and add some more gradations in color and get some more color in the raven as well. And then I cropped it so there's no white space. And then I would submit it. I would put it at the top of my document, the reflection document, and then I would take the quiz. Now let's give this a try, shall we? So if we go to the Jamboard, I want you to draw a box with 4 quadrants in it. And in that first box, I want you to stretch one letter to touch the bottom of the box, with the second letter being a bit smaller. And then in the second quadrant, I want you to kind of play around and twist those letters a bit. So here's an example, just so you can see what I'm doing. There's a link to the Jamboard. And here's some examples I've already done, but I'll try a new one. I've already got it set up here. Let's take that pen and let's do an R for Ravenstone. And I might make this the really big one that touches the top and the bottom. And then my A, I might make smaller so it just touches the bottom, and I might wrap it around a little bit. And then I could maybe stack the letters over here. So if I wanted my R to touch the top, bottom, and side, I could then add a little R, A, here, like that. And hey, I could put in a V here and really get crazy with it. I want you to play around with the tag process, just that line. And then we can go back and we can try out adding those 3D bars and throwing the piece and then piecing it. So once you've played around with that and you've developed your own tag, I want you to write a reflection piece that takes into account these key ideas. Here they are for the reminder. And this is a summary of some of the things we've been talking about last week and now this week. So read through those and think about how you want to present your identity as you engage with the political context in your community. Now, next time, our next unit is going to be looking at named, not anonymous, named artists, in particular Christo, who is also a street artist. He wraps things. So out here in New York City, he wrapped the gates as we walk into Central Park. He established the gates and then he wrapped them in this bright orange fabric. He wanted to do the same thing in Colorado with the Over the River project, but the governments wouldn't let him participate in that. Nevertheless, it's still considered a work of art, even though there's no final product. So we'll be spending a lot of time talking about that. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have fun with this project, and please email me if you have any questions. See you later.